When you look at the pottery industry, what is the predominant motive is, of course, floral and flowers, and I thought it was nice, really, that the Garden Festival actually brought real flowers back into the potteries.
Stoke-on-Trent is known the world over as the home of pottery and fine china. The Industrial Revolution saw the growth of the pottery towns. Here was the clay and the coal to fire it. Then Josiah Wedgwood, 200 years ago, decided to leave the hilltop pottery town of Burslem and build a garden factory here in the Fowley Valley. He christened the site Etruria after his so-called Etruscan-style pottery and built a hall overlooking the works. But along with the clay and coal, this area was rich in iron ore. A huge ironworks was later established and grew on the Wedgwood estate, and Etruria Hall eventually became the offices for the Shelton Bar Iron and Steel Works, which employed 2,500 men. But in 1978, the massive steelworks was closed down, except for the steel rolling mill, with the loss of 2,000 jobs. The closure left a huge area of industrial dereliction. But now this whole site has been reclaimed and landscaped, so it's a major asset to the city. And the event that made all this possible was the 1986 National Garden Festival.
That site to me is very spiritual. Having spent work there for 25 years, and watched the closure and been part of the closure of the steelworks, and watched the dereliction of buildings and the smashing down of blast furnaces which had provided North Staffordshire families for generations a good living. It was a great human tragedy. And when the event was proposed to Arthur Chellerton as leader at the time, I saw a letter dated, I think it was November 1980, to him, to the City Council, from Lord Belwyn, and I was City Party chairman at the time, and he asked me politically, because of my commitment to the site, what did I think? I said, well, anything's better than nothing if it reclaims the land alone, and what our garden festival's about.
I'd never heard the expression National Garden Festival until March 1981, when I was invited down to London with the then leader of the City Council for talks with ministers when we first heard a description of the National Garden Festival. Of course, we now know it's a concept which has three parts. The first one, the reclamation of serious dereliction. The second phase is a National Garden Festival which concentrates on flowers, shrubs and trees, but has a whole range of activities with it. And the third part of the concept is long-term development.
The reason why probably the city was invited to consider the National Garden Festival or a site was the fact that it had national and international fame for its reclamation work. And with that in mind, I think the Minister thought he was on a good bet if he came to the city of Stoke-on-Trent. And unfortunately, we had the largest piece of land dereliction in the West Midlands. So with that coupled with the invitation to go to London, yes, we were anxious, to get hold of any land reclamation monies to make it all happen.
The very fact that we were awarded National Garden Festival meant that we got the site reclaimed in 3 years, whereas it would have taken at least 15 years if we hadn't have got Garden Festival status. So the main plus from the planning point of view was the reclamation of this site for future uses.
We visited not only Mannheim, we visited, should I say, about 6 or 7 former sites of garden festivals in Germany. What we saw there was that most of the sites had not been returned to industrial use. And our idea was to turn the land after the festival to either industrial or commercial use.
It was obvious that Stoke-on-Trent's project had to go beyond just the staging of a festival. which was one part of an ambitious plan for the future use of this valuable site. A board of directors was formed comprising 5 members from the City Council, 5 from the County Council and 5 from Industry and Commerce.
We'd heard all about garden festivals and their place on the continent, but in a way they'd always been regarded as sort of exotic fripperies which foreigners indulged in rather than a solid British idea. But the landscape industry as a whole and in its various forms had been knocking at the door to try and transplant this sort of continental exotic onto the British mainland. And the interesting thing is it suddenly got caught up in the big debate about inner city decline and attraction of funds into the inner city, and the whole thing seemed to click together and get launched on that basis.
The site, which was the biggest derelict site in the West Midlands at the time, and probably true to say one of the nastiest, posed some very difficult and unique engineering problems, particularly related to the reclamation of the site in the early stages. There was obvious above-ground dereliction, not very obvious underground dereliction, and far from obvious nasty contamination of soils with the byproducts from the previous industry that had been on the site.
There were several objectives in reclaiming the site. To landscape it and make it safe for the garden festival to take place, and to bring on subsoil and peat to enable trees to be planted as the reclamation progressed. To compact as large an area as possible to make way for future building developments, and to lay concrete foundations, again for future use. To remove old power lines used by the steelworks and a local colliery, and lay new mains power cables. And to put in sewers, normal service pipes and cables, and a complete road system.
And we mustn't forget, of course, that any development of that size has got to have its access to the main network of highways, and that again meant considerable expenditure on the existing road network to make sure people could get on and off.
The first job was to buy the land from British Steel and the Duchy of Lancaster. Then a team was set up of engineers, landscape architects and planners, all employed by the City Council. Work actually commenced on the site at the end of 1982.
The major works comprising a major earthworks contract, a coal recovery contract and roadworks and sewers were commenced in the summer of 1983 and completed by the autumn of 1984. And the reclamation works were, to all intents and purposes, completed by late 1984. The reclamation works at that time involved the expenditure of approximately £6.5 million in 18 months.
It was necessary to determine the parts of the site that were capable of development for the long term, and those sites that would remain as public open space areas, which would be landscaped, planted and so on. There were 2 main reclamation problems in addition to those that we normally expect on sites similar to the one that we were tackling, and that was that there was slurries that were identified directly along the line of the main roadway that we were having to construct.
The answer to the problem was to drill down through the slurries to construct columns of concrete within the slurries and to construct roads and sewers supported on those columns. Another problem that was encountered as far as the slurries were concerned were 3 massive lagoons of very, very wet slurries which comprised wet, sloppy, black toothpaste, a real horrible goo. This material had to be removed to existing lagoons in the middle of the site, which currently form part of the Woodland Ridge, and they were loaded into lorries and carted to those lagoons. Within the Woodland Ridge they were stabilised by means of the tipping of on-site material and the importation and tipping of domestic refuse. Domestic refuse is a very good material for the stabilisation of slurry lagoons. Another problem that was encountered involved the fact that when the steelworks was demolished, the massive foundations of the steelwork structures were left. These foundations comprised mainly reinforced concrete, mass concrete and mass brickwork, and were of considerable depths and considerable thicknesses, had to be uncovered and ground removed from around them, and then they were smashed by means of earth-moving plant and compressors, and then removed to the central ridge, where they're now buried at depths under pleasant landscape.
We formed the Woodland Ridge basically from all the rubbish, for want of a better word, that the steelworks left behind when they closed. There'd always been a lot of tipping in the centre of the site. In fact, so much it would have been impossible really and impractical to ever think in terms of moving it. What we did was regrade it, add to it, and use it. So that ultimately we got a festival feature of the Woodland Ridge, which we know now is going to become a permanent parkland.
At the height of the reclamation works, there were many bulldozers, motor scrapers, lorries, excavators, all working at the same time in different areas of the site. The whole area was a veritable hive of activity.
Well, the Woodland Ridge, indeed the whole site, was very complex to plan because we had all the reclamation earthworks to do, and that involved almost 1.5 million cubic metres of material that we just moved around the site. And 30,000 cubic metres moved from A to B, 70,000 moved from X to Y. Now that was a process that lasted the best part of 18 months.
Time was always going to be the enemy on creating the festival, and this led to good horticultural practice going out of the window, carrying out operations at times of the year that one wouldn't normally carry these operations out, like, for example, spreading clay onto steep slopes rather resembling motorway embankments, into which you then tried to incorporate peat to get a reasonable planting medium in which the plants that we were going to put on there to create the woodland backcloth to the festival would grow and thrive and achieve the desired height for the opening of the festival. The planting operations started in the early 1983, January, February, resulting in that first planting period putting in 72,000 trees, followed in 1983-84 planting season with a further 35,000. In 1984-85 by a further 85,000, and finally in the run-up months immediately prior to the festival, we put something in the order of 8,000 to 12,000 trees in.
One of the other main areas of permanent works on the site, and one which was a great success in the festival, were the buildings around the marina area and the marina itself. And this the City Council played a major part in having to reach agreements with the people concerned to get those houses built, the public house built, and the marina constructed on a very tight timescale. And this is one of the few areas on the site which contained new permanent development before the festival opened.
At the end of the reclamation process, it was necessary for us to ensure that the work that we were doing was compatible with the festival requirements, and consequently we had regular meetings with Joe Samworth, the design coordinator, for that end.
I actually arrived in November 1982, and at that point in time the reclamation works were, the planning of them that is, were well advanced. In fact, they were just about to go out to tender, and it was really my first job was shape, size and circulation. The reclamation team, having given us this flat land on either side of the woodland ridge, it was necessary to connect one side to the other, so we suggested to the reclamation team that we create a cut through the ridge, and then we would have complete circulation for the pedestrians. And therefore we were able to use the road which had been provided on one side of the site as our main pedestrian route through, connect through the woodland ridge and then down onto the other side, and again utilising the roads that have been put in by the reclamation team for the future development. So that's really where the design started. And then it was a question of dividing the site up into specific design areas. Now, the object was that we'd got this woodland ridge as a background, as a backcloth, and therefore it was necessary to have areas of different character.
In landscape terms, there were 5 main design areas in the master plan: the formal gardens and marina, the area around the lakes, from the labyrinth to the festival market, the car parks and the woodland ridge itself. So there were 5 design teams working on different parts of the site. Designers of these areas and of the various festival buildings were chosen by national design competitions.
The great problem in September 83 when I got involved was that the budget allowed to develop the Garden Festival was something in the region of £5.3 million, in that had been an estimate carried out perhaps 12 or even 18 months before Joe Samworth had got involved. And frankly, with that sum of money, Joe and design team, could have built a park and not a garden festival site. So the first job really was to look at Joe's design, to cost it, which we did, and go then back to our funding partners, which is the City Council, County Council, and the Department of the Environment, to say, hey fellas, we've got a design theme here that's £12 million, but we've only got an allocation of 5.3 million. What are we going to do about it? And we spent some long, hard hours firstly negotiating, talking, justifying really the need to implement the Joe Samworth design. Having said that, we were very much aware that we were charged as a company with breaking even. Therefore, we couldn't design for, let's say, design vanity's sake. We had to design for the public, for them to come along, see the festival, enjoy it, and also to recover our capital costs. But we pressed for more money. We were told to sharpen our pencils a little bit on the master plan, and in fact we, in a sense, by planting trees slightly further apart perhaps than Joe would have liked, we were able to chop something like £1 to £1.5 million off the cost estimate, to take it down from £12 million worth of capital to 10.5, which thankfully our funding partners were able to fund. So we appointed numerous design teams, allocated budgets, and I think from my point of view that the pleasing factor at the end of the day was that we built the festival within budget. We achieved Joe's concept. In fact, I think we achieved a lot more than Joe's concept, because we did have something like £5 or £6 million worth of enhancement sponsorship. And bearing in mind we spent £10.5, £11 million, and other people spent £5 or £6 million of their own money, that was quite good. A third of the end product was funded by outsiders through our commercial awareness and, as, in a sense, salesmanship, and convincing people, yes, it's a worthwhile project to get involved with.
I arrived in mid-August 1984, and there were only 20 months to go then before the festival opened, and so we obviously had to get a move on. The reclamation work was coming to an end, and the reclamation team had done a first-class job, and the city engineer must get the credit for that. The site looked horrific when I took it over. It was a great sea of mud, but some reclamation planting had been done, and we had the first of what was to end up being like 32 different master plans. What we had to do was to work together to make sure that we could embrace offers from people like tradesmen or commercial enterprises or people who wanted to promote themselves on the site in partnership with us, invest in some of the buildings ourselves, bring on people who were, for example, going to provide a cable car for our visitors. We provided the train ourselves and manned it ourselves. But to make all those things work, because we had to satisfy the railway inspectorate, the health and safety people, we had to overcome probably the worst winter for some 40 years, and then the worst spring for 43 years. And the management team were pretty stretched. We met as a group most days, but had a very big festival management team meeting once a week. And so from reclamation to opening day was a hectic time, a very rewarding time, a group of people from different professions working together in harmony.
Having the connections that I had with the area, feeling rather nostalgic, I decided that I would become involved in the opening day. So I booked the day off work, and the evening before I arrived in the car, and I actually spent the night sleeping in the car just to be the first in. And it was a nice surprise really, because it turned out that there was a prize for the first 3 people in, and that was a season ticket, which was very nice.
Everybody entered into the spirit of the fact that we had a festival in the future, and that festival and the works had got to be achieved by a certain date. And there's no way in which you can say to Her Majesty the Queen, I'm sorry, we're not quite ready, come next week.
The site was opened to the public on May the 1st, and on May the 8th, the National Garden Festival was officially opened by Her Majesty the Queen.
Having the canal alongside the site, it had always been in the minds, at least of the city, that the most should be made of that, and there should be something off the canal. And the idea was a marina in the corner of the site next to the main road, so that it could be clearly seen from everywhere. And therefore, the great idea was to let's get some good residential development and a pub. And of course the pub would obviously have a captive audience, and it would be a goer. I mean, it certainly was a goer at Liverpool, there's no doubt about that. And so we had 15 terraced houses and 5 detached houses, and that gave us a grand opportunity to create small gardens, the sort of gardens that everybody has, the majority of people have, the sort of 12-foot by 12-foot patch, and therefore a grand opportunity to show what can be done in a very small space. Moving along the site, we have Etruria Hall, 1769, built and formal in its style, a grand opportunity to create formal gardens and to tell the story of British gardening. After all, it is a national garden festival, so let's say what medieval gardens were like, let's see a Tudor knot garden, let's see how Capability Brown would do it.
And the thing that was nice there, I don't think it's something that came out specifically during the festival, but Etruria Hall historically is linked to the founding of the Royal Horticultural Society. So it was very appropriate in its own way that Etruria Hall was revamped and cleaned and had exhibitions and overlooked the formal gardens, into which there was the sort of whole history and theme of British gardening from 1066 to the year 2000 was incorporated with the cottage garden, the wildflower garden, the Tudor garden, the Elizabethan way with all its water, its running water fountains, and then the grand palm house just above the formal gardens, a sort of modern interpretation of the old classical conservatory. And then further north, the lakes, the subject of a national design competition. 3 lakes all linked, so the water was always running between them.
And then adjacent to the lakes would be the festival hall, so that would be the sort of real horticultural and the intense part. bit like Chelsea really, but not over 4 or 5 days, over 180 days.
Greenhouse 2000 was built by the City Council at a cost of £1 million and covers 6,500 square metres. Apart from the many and varied festival exhibitions held there, it remains as the Parks Department's new high-tech nursery. It produces all the plants needed to maintain the landscape planting and floral decoration in the city.
Then moving through the woodland ridge and the rocky valley, that was the sort of narrow space. So we've come from a big space through a narrow space, and then we wanted to open up again and sort of an explosion of space, like all good design really. And it was at that point that we were getting up onto the slope rather more, and it was there we created another design area, which was the labyrinth, and that was an opportunity to produce water sequences, fountains, and gave the landscape designers a great opportunity to really go to town in terms of landscape, introduce lots of new ideas.
Coming down the slopes from the labyrinth was an events area with a big top for drama and music events. And the large arena, used for many activities, including a unique staging of London's Royal Tournament.
Then the festival market area, we were much more ambitious than Liverpool in that it was in effect a sort of town centre with a lot of shopping units. And then we had to have enough car parking. It soon became evident after Liverpool that the car parking area as initially planned in the master plan wasn't big enough. We had to have 7,000 parking spaces. But then beyond that start to come all the theme gardens. First 10, then 20, then 30, then 50, then 70, and then the 30 bedding displays. Each one had to be designed itself.
The festival was advertised under the banner of festive, floral and fun, and I think really it succeeded in all those three. Nice catchy jingle if you like. Festive, certainly, because it was colourful and bright and there were always people moving around. Floral, well, more than 80 bedding displays, some of which were quite stunning. And fun, constant series of events, sponsored events, marching bands, the street theatre. I think everyone who saw him will remember the man with the plant pot on his head, reading. The time I saw him, he was there reading the Financial Times.
What's the matter? What's wrong? What is it? Frightened somewhere?
I mean, my impression, I think, was very similar to a lot of other people. I mean, I remember the staff. The Americans always say, "Can I have a nice day?" But I think we did it so much better than I've ever seen it done by Americans. I mean, the people of Stoke, the people who manned the festival, said it because they really meant it. And they had this lovely memory of was one of the staff's description of the sculptures on site. He said, "If you don't know what it is, and it doesn't move, it's a sculpture."
The sculpture coordinator very enthusiastic, great opportunity. Let's have more sculptures than have been seen in Britain since the Festival of Britain. So we had something like 100 sculptures, all different and a lot designed specifically for the site and by young people.
The nice thing about sculpture, it always seems to spark a reaction. There's no in between. People either like it or they don't. And we've got to be quite honest, there were some sculptures in the area which I was involved in, the Woodland Ridge, which I liked. There were some which I think I can, let's be honest and say there were one or two heated arguments.
The Woodland Ridge forms a backbone to the site which otherwise is fairly flat. This made it easy for people to get around the site, and nearly 2.5 million visitors came during the 6-month festival. It had always been the intention to have some sort of vertical feature which could be seen from anywhere on the park, and so help people find their way around. It would also make the site visible from a distance. This turned out to be the cable car, which also had the advantage that people could go up and see the whole park from above.
I think people often, when they were planning their visit, thought they could see it all in 2 hours. But when they came and saw the size of it, they realised that it was an enormous site, packed full of things for them to see. I mean, we built 100 structures. There were 3 different modes of transport. There were 66 different counters for catering. There were heritage areas. There were brand new areas. There were old features of old medieval type gardens. There was the lavatory garden, the loo garden provided by Twyford's, which was very funny, very whimsical. But I think the difficult thing was to get people to understand that they'd been 2 hours and you were chatting to them about it, and they hadn't seen half that was there. I think the water display, the small horses on the hill, the rural farm, and all these things were added up to a marvellous day out for any member of the family.
Virtually every family in the city is touched by that site in one form or another. I met steelworkers on the site during the Garden Festival, and it was magnificent to them because we were restoring something to its former glory when Josiah Wedgwood had it 200 years ago. I mean, we'd mutilated that site, 137 years of iron and steel making, smelting Mother Earth. As I stood atop of the Woodland Ridge, and all my memories flooded back on that site of all the smoke-filled valley, choked up, the blast furnaces working, the fires burning fiercely at night, and all the people. You could see, I could mentally see them. And it was enormous pride that I stood there. I'd actually been there on the Garden Festival site.
But what of the commercial side of the festival?
The commercial department was mainly involved with the income for the festival. And apart from the admission charges, this was achieved by selling festival catalogues and guides, by renting out festival market stalls, and by sponsorship. And the biggest part of that, of course, was sponsorship. The total sponsorship which we got into the festival was over £6 million. Obviously, in a garden festival, the first thing that comes to mind are the gardens. And the sort of people who sponsored garden ranged from commercial organisations, such as Stately Water Gardens, such as Bridgemere Nurseries, to very big local companies. Local authorities, we had the West Midlands County Council, who involved all their local authorities and came in and built a magnificent garden. Blackpool built marvellous gardens. And we had T.I. Creeder, we had British Rail, we had H&R Johnson's, who came in and spent £50,000 sponsoring trains. The Festival Hall, Wedgwoods came into the Festival Hall. Royal Doulton sponsored the Rose Garden. Century Oils, who sponsored the hot air balloon. That travelled all over the country, publicising the festival. Michelin produced their Michelin Guide. and they agree to produce the first 1 million copies of the festival guide, and of course that brings in its own income too.
Apart from local firms, sponsorship came from such national companies as Kodak, Austin Rover, Imperial Tobacco, and on the energy side, the nationalised industries.
Having built the festival on time, within budget, and in fact well within budget, having saved some money, we had to do a similar thing with the running of the festival, and that involved two things. One is expenditure going out on salaries, on maintenance of the site, on site security, on staff costs and so on. But also we had to effectively manage the various incomes coming into the company, whether they were from tickets sold for cash or through post office or through tour operators or from whatever source, which I think we enjoyed anyway.
I think one of the great successes of the festival was the enthusiasm of the staff, and bear in mind that maybe 800 of them had come straight off the dole and were young people, and all the pleasant things that were said about the festival, I think 80% of them were said about the staff and their attitude, and it just shows what the people of Stoke can do, and particularly the young people.
And everyone mentioned that. Everybody in their letters said how courteous and how helpful the staff were. And some of them obviously identified that they were short-term workers and manpower services schemes. And they said, isn't it nice to think those people, even though they have been unemployed, could still do an excellent job and be ambassadors for the city and say, please come back again.
I mean, their whole approach to the public set a new standard of the leisure industry. The cleanliness of the site was commented on by hundreds of thousands of letters from people. And I think the welcoming attitude and the general wish to give customers a good deal, value for money, and to show off the festival spoke reams for Stoke-on-Trent and its people, and was bound to impress both those coming looking for future commercial opportunities, but also the run-of-the-mill visitor who didn't know the potteries, but went away with a lasting impression of the warmth and spontaneity and niceness of the people.
Capability Brown, 1769, when Truro Hall was built, was about the last guy that was given a chance to do a landscape on that sort of magnitude, starting from scratch. And when I think back to Germany, and it cost in the equivalent of £60 million to put on a garden festival, and 10 years to do it in, we did it for a third of a price in a third of the time. I think it was good value for money. So apart from being a job of a lifetime, I think it was one tremendous achievement as well on the part of many designers, and working together with the financial people and everybody else.
I think what's so unique about this site is that here we are in the middle of, slap bang in the middle of quite a large industrial city, and for once it's a case of actually finding a development of the quality which will match the quality of the environment. Now that must be unique in planning history almost, because the usual thing is to bring a scheme in and then impose conditions on it to produce a landscape which will then fit around it. Here it's quite the reverse.
I wanted 2,000 jobs back on that site, because that's how many came off it in 1978. Well, I'm delighted to say that the 100 million investment will be over 2,000 jobs. There'll be about 2,500 jobs back on that site. It's up to all of us, right, to look to the future and promote that site and enhance that site in such a way that it'll be here for another 200 years.
So the National Garden Festival has been a catalyst for all this potential development. But it was also an important event in the history of Stoke-on-Trent, with wide-ranging influences. The great involvement of local school children in festival projects, both on site and in their schools. The improvements made to all the approach routes to the city. The Green Street project, working with schools, community groups and local industry to landscape and plant the many small sites of unsightly or derelict land that all cities have. So it's done a great deal to enhance people's awareness of their environment and instill a feeling of pride in their city.
I've been talking to you as town clerk of the city, and therefore I might give you the impression that this is all to do with meetings, discussions, plans, money. But I've got such marvellous memories of this garden festival, and they're going to stay with me and my family for all time. And it's not just me. So many thousands of people in the area and people who came to the area. The opening day, the official opening, the visit of the Queen, the awful weather in the first few weeks, but the marvellous morale that all the people had on the site, all those youngsters whose smiles didn't dissolve just because it was wet for a few weeks and then the weather came good, and all the other marvellous events. The Royal Tournament, unheard of for the Royal Tournament to leave the big city. But, you know, we've blazed a trail here in the city, and it's marvellous to be a part of that, and sad to me that it's not going to happen all over again this year, but those memories are going to be there for all time, and no one can take that away from you.
I mean, the Garden Festival for me will be a memory that I will treasure throughout my life, particularly the last day. That tremendous spirit that all the people who worked on it is one of life's abiding memories.
The Garden Festival, I would say, was a pivotal moment for Stoke. We suddenly were on the map nationally. People knew about this Garden Festival at Stoke who had never been to Stoke before, and I think the Garden Festival probably was one of the best public relations exercises of the century as far as Stoke-on-Trent was concerned. I only wish Arnold Bennett had been alive to see it.
With being the first one in, I thought, well, I've got to be the last one out, haven't I? And I was the last one out.
It was the biggest event that will happen in Stoke-on-Trent in the whole of this century. And it has given us the opportunity of actually kind of putting the city before the eyes of everybody in this country, but not only in this country, but throughout the world.